Most gardeners think that the only way to get new fruit trees is to go to the nursery and buy them. But the truth is you can make brand new fruit trees from cuttings, and it's simpler than you might think. So today in this video, I'm going to show you how to propagate a pomegranate tree. And the great thing is this method works for lots of different fruit trees. So let's do it. This is one of my pomegranate trees. As you can see, it's a little bit overgrown. It's the end of the summer. I definitely need to give it a trim. So I'm going to use this tree as an example for how to do propagation from cuttings. So the first step is actually choosing the right cutting. And a great way to do that is when you're pruning, right? Especially in this case, summer pruning, because the tree is actively still growing. Now is actually a good time to take cuttings and root them because the tree still has energy. You can also do this during the winter. You can take dormant cuttings when you're pruning at the end of winter for certain fruit trees. That works really well too, because once it is spring, it's going to start to wake up and have the energy to put in roots. But for now, I'm going to do double duty. I'm going to trim this tree, particularly all of the new growth that's coming from the bottom of the tree, the root suckers. For some trees, a lot of water shoots and root suckers is a sign of stress, but that's not true for pomegranate trees. This is just kind of how they grow. They grow in a shrubby form naturally, and then you select a few main branches. And if you want to see more about how to prune a pomegranate tree overall, I'll link to a video that I have on that. But for now, I'm just going to concentrate on clearing out the growth at the bottom of the tree, and then I'll show you how to choose the right cutting. The hard part is getting in here to see what's going on. When it comes to taking cuttings for propagating, not all cuttings are created equal. So what you're looking for is a piece of wood that's about 8 to 10 inches long and about the width of a pencil, or the width of your pinky, depending on how big your pinky is. So something like this is just about right. These are technically semi-hardwood cuttings, which means it's this year's growth, but it's later in the season, and so it's already started to harden just a little bit. But they're still like first-year cuttings. They're still green. I like propagating with this type of wood whenever possible. You can use newer wood, you can use something that's greener, but the problem is they tend to dry out more quickly before they have a chance to root, so they're a little harder to care for. But if you use a cutting that's too woody and too old, it can also have trouble rooting. And so this is kind of splitting the difference. So I like this type of semi-hardwood cutting, and let me show you some examples of what doesn't work. Hopefully you can see a little bit, but this cutting is too thin. I would not try propagating from a cutting this thin, because it's just not going to have the energy to root, and it's going to have a harder time staying alive long enough to put out roots. On the other hand, this is far too thick. You can see just how thick this cutting is. And this one also is going to struggle to root, because when the cutting hardens, like I said a minute ago, when it hardens too much, the outer layers get thick and it has a harder time pushing out roots. It's possible, but it's just less reliable. So if we go a little further, closer to the tip of the same branch, we get to something that's just about perfect, the Goldilocks spot, if you will. Just right, not too thick, not too thin. So now that we've got our selections made, let's go prepare these cuttings. All right, so here are some of my trimmings. This is by no means all of the ones that I just cut off the tree. I could make so many new pomegranate trees if I really wanted to. I don't need that many, but let's see how many I can get out of what's here. So I'm gonna start by taking each of these branches that are about the right thickness and just cutting them into roughly 8 to 10 inch sections. When you do this, I highly recommend that you keep the top of each cutting flat and the bottom of each cutting angled. There's a couple reasons for that. So for one thing, that helps you differentiate from the top and the bottom of the cutting, because if I plant it upside down, there's no roots that are going to grow out of that. We want to grow roots out of the bottom, the part that was toward the bottom of the tree. So I can see I have an angled end and a flat end. This also prevents as much moisture as possible from escaping from the top, while allowing for more surface area to be in contact with our rooting hormone, which I'll talk about more in just a second, as well as with the soil, and be able to uptake water and everything and get rooting. So another thing, when you're cutting, we've got our angled cut down here, you want to have at least one node end up in the soil. preferably more than one, because those are the places that roots are most likely to come out of. That's where the hormones are going to concentrate and send out new growth. So just make sure when you're cutting that you leave about 1 to 2 nodes intact that are going to be under the soil, and then a little bit of growth on top of that. That's why we're aiming for that 8 to 10 inch length. Make sure when you do this too that your pruning shears are nice and sharp. You want these wounds to be clean. And these are wounds. That's essentially what we're doing, is making wounds, strategic wounds. Because when you do that, whenever you wound a tree, it starts to behave in certain ways to try to fix that wound. In this case, it's going to send those growth hormones down to that part of the tree to heal it, or in this case, to grow new roots. So here are all my cuttings. Now the next step is to strip off all of the leaves except for just the top 2 or 3. This part feels wasteful, but don't worry, this is all going to go in my compost. But it's really important to do this because you want to make sure that all of this little cuttings energy is going to forming those roots rather than keeping a bunch of greenery alive. The other thing is the leaves are one of the main places that any plant loses moisture. So this is a game of keeping these things alive long enough to root. So if it's losing more moisture than it can take in, especially because it doesn't have any roots right now, so this is really the only way it can take in moisture, then it's never going to stay alive long enough to root. While I'm working on this, let's talk about what kinds of fruit trees you can propagate this way, because it doesn't work for all of them, but it works really well for some. So figs work super well propagated from cuttings. I've had very little issue no matter how or when I do it. That works really well. Fig trees, mulberry trees, grapevines, even some stone fruits, just sort of depending on what type it is. But one of the key things is that you want to make sure that it's not a grafted tree. So it doesn't work well to grow from cuttings on grafted trees, because if you try to do that, then the tree that you get won't be the tree that you took the cutting from. Trees are grafted to give them certain desirable characteristics, whether it's just to keep them a certain size, keep them dwarf, or to make them more disease resistant, or to have some other fruit quality. All that to say that you don't want to take cuttings from a tree that's grafted onto something else unless you're willing to gamble what you're going to get. But for those trees that I mentioned, figs, mulberries, you could also do this with grapevines, super easy to root from cuttings, as well as berry bushes like raspberries and blackberries. So give it a try if you haven't yet. Even if you don't have a ton of room for new plants in your own garden, you can always give them to a friend. And speaking from experience, it's a really great way to make friends because, you know, who doesn't want a free plant? Okay, so all my cuttings are prepped and ready, and now we just have to plant them. So what I'm using to pot up my cuttings, anytime I do this, you don't have to get too fussy with it, but what you do want to make sure is whatever it is a relatively light mix, nothing heavy with like a lot of clay that you dig up from your garden, because you want the roots to be able to penetrate really easily. So this right here is a mixture of coconut coir and vermiculite mostly, and then I put in just a little bit of potting mix. So very simple. It's dampened a little bit. So now let's get my cuttings in. So here is rooting powder or rooting hormone. This is not absolutely required. The cuttings very well may root without this, but it's just a little bit of extra insurance. So the way this works, take one of your cuttings. You're just going to dip it in the rooting powder and tap off the excess. And this just kind of gives the plant a little bit of a head start in growing those roots. Now, rather than sticking it straight into the dirt and then wiping off all of that rooting powder, I like to use a dowel, or in this case, I'm just using a pencil to poke a hole and get the cutting inside. Does anybody else's kids just have a ton of free pencils that they bring home from school and then they never get used? Well, here you go. Here's a use for it. Just a little reminder, make sure you're dipping the angled end into the rooting powder so that you're planting these right side up. It may look like I'm crowding these together, but at this point, it really doesn't matter if they're jammed into one pot. This is like how I like to do it. It makes it a lot easier to take care of. Once they start rooting, I can then separate them out and put them each into their own individual pot to continue to grow. But at this stage, it's sort of nice to keep it all together so that you can just keep an eye on it and only have one thing to take care of instead of a bunch of little things. All right, now let's take it to its new home. Cuttings like this really don't like extremes, so you want to keep it moist but not soaking wet. You want it to get bright light, but only indirectly. So here I've placed mine in a shady spot next to my house, but as you can see, right near a lot of reflected bright light. And bonus, it's right by my hose. So every time I'm watering something, I'll remember to check my cuttings and see if they need water, because I have definitely killed cuttings before by forgetting to water them. You can absolutely cover these with plastic, or like a plastic bag or something like that, to let light in, but keep them humid and keep them moist. That can really help them prevent moisture loss, especially if your cuttings are really, really green. Honestly, where I am, it's still so humid right now that I'm not even gonna worry about it. It's not gonna be a problem. They get enough moisture from the air, so they're not gonna wilt too quickly. Depending on the time of year it is, you could notice new roots forming anywhere from just a few weeks to a couple of months. It does take patience, but it is worth it, and you'll see signs of new growth before too long. Now the question is, how can you be sure it's working? Let me show you. Here you go. Here's how you can be sure it's working. Less than a year ago, this pot was full of cuttings that looked just like these sticks right here. And now this is what we have, a whole bunch of brand new pomegranate trees. Clearly it's time for me to pot these up individually, so I'm gonna do that now. But I just want you to see how simple it is and what the result can be. Now, admittedly, it will take several years before these trees bear fruit. And that's just the game with fruit trees. It always takes a while. The tree has to be mature enough and established to get fruit. But that day will come. And in the meantime, you've created, oh gosh, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 whole new pomegranate bushes that you can plant somewhere in your garden, you can put in a pot and tuck away somewhere, or like I said before, you can give to a friend and make someone else really happy. You know, I'm almost embarrassed to admit how little work it took to go from just sticks in a pot of dirt to these fully grown pomegranate trees. And you saw how good the root systems are. And admittedly, basically all I did was shoot a little bit of water on the cuttings when I was near the hose and I noticed they looked a little dry. That's pretty much it. So this is why I call this method foolproof, because it's so easy to do, whether you're a really experienced gardener or whether this is something that's new to you. Give it a try. I mean, what's the worst that happens? They don't take and you've got some extra sticks for your compost pile. But chances are, if you use a pomegranate tree or a fig tree or one of those other plants I mentioned, it will work for you, and it takes remarkably little effort. Let me know in the comments if you've ever propagated fruit trees from cuttings this way, and feel free to share any helpful tips or tricks you may have. It really does not take a lot to basically start a whole new fruit grove, whether you're planning to plant some more trees in your own garden or give them to a friend. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.